At 2 a.m. on the 6th of May 1942, deep inside Malinta Tunnel on Corregidor, an army nurse bent over a wounded soldier as the ceiling trembled above her. The lights did not go out completely. They only dimmed for a second, then came back weak and yellow, the way lights do when the wiring has been shaken too many times. Dust drifted down from the concrete overhead. Somewhere beyond the rock, above the tunnel and beyond the mouth of the island, Japanese artillery was still working methodically through the night, hammering the last American fortress in the Philippines into silence. The nurse did not look up. There was no time for that. Her hands were pressed against a dressing that had already soaked through. The soldier on the cot was young. Most of them were young. He had the thin, gray look of a man who had been wounded after too many weeks without enough food, too little sleep, and no belief left that rescue was coming. His lips moved before any sound came out. "Are we still holding?" It was not really a military question. Not anymore. By then, maps had become rumors. Orders came late, if they came at all. Radios crackled, stopped, returned with half-sentences. Outside the tunnel, men who had once believed Corregidor could endure were watching the guns fall silent one by one. The nurse answered quietly. Maybe she said yes. Maybe she said nothing. What mattered was that she stayed. That was the strange truth of the last hours on Corregidor. The front was collapsing. The fortress was dying. The chain of command was bending under a weight it could no longer carry. But inside the tunnel hospital, the war had narrowed to the size of a cot, a bandage, a pulse beneath 2 fingers. They had believed nurses belonged behind the front. In theory, that had been true. Nurses were trained to receive the wounded after the fighting had passed over them. They were part of the medical system behind the guns, behind the infantry, behind the chaos. They were expected to work hard, to be calm, to endure ugly things but not to become trapped inside a collapsing battlefield. But war has a way of moving the line. In the Philippines, the line moved backward through airfields, roads, jungle, beaches, hospitals, and finally into a tunnel beneath a bombed island. And when it arrived there, the women inside could not step away. The wounded could not be abandoned because the map had changed. So they kept working. There were stretchers against the walls, men with burns, men with shrapnel wounds, men shaking with malaria. Men whose uniforms had been cut away and thrown into corners because there was no reason to preserve cloth when flesh itself was hard enough to save. The air inside Malinta Tunnel was thick with antiseptic, sweat, blood, oil, smoke, and the human smell of too many people breathing underground. Outside, the Japanese believed the fortress was almost finished. They were right. But what they could not measure from outside the tunnel was this. A fortress can collapse before its people stop resisting. Sometimes the last resistance is not a machine gun. It is not a final artillery round. It is a nurse refusing to leave a wounded man alone while concrete dust falls into his open wound. Only a few months earlier, many of these women had been living in Manila, working in hospitals that still felt connected to order, sunlight, and normal time. The Philippines had been a posting. Then it became a trap. And once the trap closed, the nurses would learn that the most dangerous part of war was not always the moment of attack. Sometimes it was what came after, the paradise posting that became a trap. Before the sirens, before the burned airfields, before the retreat into Bataan, the Philippines could still look like a world apart from the war. Manila had sunlight, traffic, officers' clubs, hospital corridors polished by routine, and evenings when the sea air moved slowly through open windows. For many American nurses, assignment to the Philippines was not imagined as a march into disaster. It was overseas duty, yes, it was military service. But it was also a place with structure, rank, meals, paperwork, patience, friendships, and the ordinary rhythms of a garrison that had not yet heard the first bomb fall close enough to shake the glass. They were professionals. That should be said plainly. They were not visitors drifting through an exotic posting. They were Army and Navy nurses, trained, disciplined, and accustomed to pain. But the war that was growing across the Pacific still seemed, to many people in power, like something that could be predicted on paper. Bases could be reinforced, fleets could deter, airfields could hold. The Philippines, if attacked, would fight according to plans drawn in offices far from the humidity, the roads, the jungle, and the actual range of Japanese aircraft. That was what they believed. What really happened began with sound. Air raid warnings, engines overhead, explosions at Clark Field, smoke rising where aircraft had been lined up on the ground. Rumors moved faster than official orders. Pearl Harbor had been attacked, but the Philippines was not spared the opening blow. Japanese aircraft came across the sky, and the distance that had seemed so comforting disappeared in a single day. Hospitals changed first in small ways. Windows were covered, lights were controlled, staff moved differently. Men who had spoken casually the week before began to lower their voices over maps. Nurses learned to listen for the difference between distant engines and approaching ones. They learned that a building could feel solid until the first blast made dust jump from the ceiling. Then the casualties arrived. At first, there was still a belief that the system would absorb them. Wounded men would be treated, moved, sorted, recorded. That was the purpose of military medicine. That was why hospitals existed. Order would answer violence. But the numbers grew. Roads clogged. Units fell back. Japanese landings pushed the campaign into a new shape. The withdrawal toward Bataan began to turn the entire medical network into something more fragile and more desperate than anyone had wanted to admit. The nurses did not receive a dramatic speech explaining that history had changed. There was no clean line between peace and catastrophe. There were only orders, hurried packing, patients moved in heat and confusion, and the steady realization that the front was not somewhere else. It was approaching. For commanders, the retreat to Bataan was a military maneuver. For the wounded, it was a journey through pain. For the nurses, it was the moment their profession stopped being protected by distance. They followed the injured into a narrowing peninsula where supplies would run down, disease would rise, and the sky itself would become dangerous. What they had believed was simple enough. The hospital was behind the war. What really happened was that the hospital moved with the defeat. The women who had once walked through Manila corridors now entered a landscape of trucks, stretchers, field tents, jungle roads, mud, fever, and exhausted men who had not yet understood how long the coming siege would last. When the order came to withdraw, the nurses did not move away from danger. They moved toward the men danger had already reached. Bataan, the hospital without walls. Bataan did not look like the kind of place where medicine was supposed to happen. There were no clean hospital blocks, no quiet recovery wards, no reliable separation between the wounded and the war that had wounded them. There were trees, tents, dirt paths, mosquitoes, damp blankets, surgical tables, rows of cots, and the constant knowledge that the enemy did not have to break through the line to reach the patients. The sky could do that. The Army established large field hospitals on Bataan, including open-air facilities that would become part of the grim memory of the campaign. Men arrived from the line in trucks, on stretchers, sometimes carried by other men who looked only slightly less broken. Some came with shrapnel wounds, some with burns, some with tropical disease, some with the hollow-eyed exhaustion of soldiers who had been retreating too long under bombing and hunger. The nurses worked under trees and canvas. Rain turned paths into mud, heat made dressings sour, flies found blood quickly. At night, the darkness was never restful, because darkness only changed the shape of fear. It hid the aircraft until the engines were close. It made every distant detonation feel as if it might be the first of many. Men who had slept through artillery in Europe might have understood the rhythm of shelling. Bataan had its own rhythm: heat, fever, aircraft, hurried surgery, silence, then more engines. In theory, a wounded soldier moved backward through a chain: frontline, aid station, clearing station, hospital, evacuation. But Bataan was running out of backward. That was the hidden problem no plan could solve. The medical system depended on space, supplies, movement, and time. The peninsula had less of each every day. The wounded could be treated, but where would they go after that? A man might survive the first wound, only to face infection. He might survive surgery, only to face malaria. He might be saved from bleeding out and then weakened by hunger until his body had little strength left to heal. The nurses saw this before many reports could express it. They saw it in the color of a man's skin when shock set in. They saw it in the way fever changed the eyes. They saw it when dressings had to be stretched, when instruments had to be cleaned and reused, when morphine became not a certainty but a question. One night, doctors and nurses gave their own blood for the wounded. That detail should not be passed over quickly. Blood is not an idea. It is warmth leaving one body in the hope that another body will keep breathing. It is a nurse sitting down for a moment, not because she is resting, but because her own blood is being taken for a man she may never know. They had believed nurses were there to assist the medical system. What really happened was that, when the system thinned and cracked, the nurses became part of the structure holding it upright. The Japanese believed pressure would break Bataan through force, hunger, and exhaustion. They were not wrong about the pressure. It was everywhere. But inside the hospitals, something stubborn continued. Wounds were cleaned. Fevers were watched. Men were turned, lifted, fed if food could be found, cooled if fever climbed, held if death came too close. The generals measured Bataan in miles of ground lost. The nurses measured it in bandages, morphine, fever, and minutes. And the cruel truth was that minutes were becoming harder to buy. What they believed, nurses were for. Before the war stripped away ceremony, nurses occupied a strange place inside the military world. They were respected, but not always understood. Needed, but often underestimated. Praised in language that made them sound gentle, noble, almost symbolic, while the actual work they did was physical, technical, exhausting, and often brutal. They were expected to bring calm into suffering, but the system did not fully imagine what would happen when suffering arrived in numbers too large for calm alone. The military knew it needed nurses. It did not always know what kind of power they represented. On paper, they were not combat troops. They did not command battalions. They did not move artillery. They did not pilot aircraft or fire coastal guns. They stood outside the heroic language of battle, and because they stood outside that language, history would later struggle to describe them properly. But in Bataan, that distinction began to lose meaning. A soldier with a severed artery did not need a speech about strategy. He needed pressure, speed, and someone who could keep her hands steady while aircraft passed overhead. A man in shock did not care whether the person saving him had been imagined by the army as auxiliary. He needed warmth, fluids, attention, and the practiced eye of someone who could see death beginning before it announced itself. The nurses controlled small things. Small things decided lives. A dry dressing, a cleaned wound, a changed position, a cup of water, a temperature recorded at the right time, a surgeon warned before a patient crashed, a frightened man spoken to in a voice low enough to keep him from tearing at his own bandages, a fever noticed before it became delirium. None of that looked like strategy from a headquarters map. But when the line collapsed, survival became a chain of small acts done correctly under impossible conditions. That was battlefield reality. The system believed care happened after combat. Bataan proved care was part of combat. It was not separate from the fight. It was what happened when the fight entered the body and stayed there. There was another belief too, quieter but just as dangerous. Some believed women would need protection from the worst face of war. In a decent world, perhaps they would have. But war does not pause to preserve anyone's idea of what women should be spared from seeing. They saw amputations. They saw men cry for mothers and wives. They saw soldiers with the kind of wounds that leave no clean memory behind. They saw courage, cowardice, pain, infection, confusion, and the blank look that comes when the body has gone farther than the mind can follow. And still they returned to the next cot. Not because they were fearless. Fear was there. It lived in the body. It tightened the throat when aircraft engines approached. It lived in the pause before a bomb fell close enough to make the ground jump. It lived in the knowledge that the red crosses and hospital markings might not be enough. But duty had become more immediate than fear. When morphine ran low, calm became a form of mercy. When food ran low, patience became a form of discipline. When evacuation failed, presence became a form of resistance. The old belief was that nurses stood behind the men who fought. Bataan revealed something harder. Sometimes the wounded are the battlefield, and sometimes the person standing beside them is the last line that has not broken. But even that line needed supplies. And supplies were disappearing, the mathematics of dying slowly. A siege does not only kill with bullets, it kills by subtraction. First, there is less food, then less medicine, then less blood, less sleep, less clean water, less quinine, less strength in the men carrying stretchers. Less distance between the hospital and the enemy, less hope that tomorrow will be easier than today. On Bataan, survival became arithmetic. Not the neat arithmetic of a staff officer's report, but the cruel arithmetic of bodies under stress. A wound that might have been survivable in a stable hospital became dangerous in the heat. An infection that might have been controlled with proper supplies became a race. A fever that might have passed became deadly when the patient had not eaten enough and had slept for days in damp air under mosquitoes. The nurses did not need anyone to explain the equation. They watched it happen. A soldier arrived with a wound. He was treated. The bleeding slowed. For a moment, it looked like a small victory. Then fever rose. Then the wound changed color. Then he stopped wanting food. Then his pulse became something the nurse checked more often, not because orders required it, but because experience told her the body was slipping. Every hour mattered. Every bandage mattered. Every bottle mattered. The medical war in Bataan was fought through scarcity. If there was plasma, it had to go where it could do the most good. If there was morphine, someone had to decide when pain relief was necessary and when it had to be saved. If instruments were used, they had to be cleaned and made ready again. If a nurse sat down, it was often only long enough to gather herself before the next truck arrived. The numbers in a siege are never only numbers. A ration cut is a hand shaking while tying a bandage. A shortage of quinine is a ward full of men sweating through fever. A lack of transport is a wounded soldier remaining too long near the place he was hit. A missing shipment is a surgeon looking at a case and knowing what should be done, then knowing what cannot be done. That is where the nurses lived, between what medicine knew and what war allowed. The Japanese command understood pressure. They understood that Bataan could be starved, bombed, and compressed until resistance weakened. But they may not have fully understood the kind of endurance happening inside the hospitals. It was not dramatic. It did not show up as a counterattack. It did not change the front line. It changed whether a man lived through the night. There is a difference between saving an army and saving the people inside it. By early 1942, the first was becoming impossible in the Philippines. The second was still being attempted cot by cot. That was the nurses' battlefield reality. They were fighting time, fever, infection, shock, hunger, and fear. Japan was the visible enemy. But the invisible enemies were everywhere, and some of them were already inside the blood. Then came the evacuation orders. And evacuation, in a collapsing campaign, is never only rescue. It is selection, the evacuation that could not save everyone. No one leaves a doomed place cleanly. That is one of the quiet truths of war. Departure may be called evacuation. It may be written into orders. It may be justified by necessity, and often rightly so. But for the people standing at the edge of it, evacuation is also a question that has no merciful answer. Who goes? Who stays? Who decides? As Bataan became impossible to hold, some nurses were moved, some reached Corregidor, some would later be taken out by aircraft or submarine. Those who left did not simply escape danger. They carried it with them in memory. The faces of patients still on cots, the colleagues still working underground, the knowledge that survival had required leaving others behind. Late in April 1942, a group of nurses departed Corregidor by Navy aircraft. One plane reached safety, another was forced down on Mindanao, and the women aboard were captured. In early May, just before the fortress fell, a submarine carried a small group of nurses away toward Australia. Behind them, dozens remained inside Malinta Tunnel with the wounded. That number matters less as a statistic than as an image. A submarine at night, a narrow hatch, women carrying little, the sound of water against metal, the knowledge that above them the fortress still burned. A few were leaving the trap, but the trap itself remained full of people. For commanders, evacuation was a military calculation. Nurses were trained personnel. They could serve elsewhere. Keeping them from capture made sense. The war would continue beyond the Philippines, and trained nurses were not easily replaced. But for the nurses, duty had a human face. It had the face of the man whose dressing had to be changed before morning, the face of a fever patient too weak to lift his head, the face of a colleague who smiled too quickly because neither woman wanted to say what both understood. Those who stayed did not necessarily choose martyrdom. That word is too polished for what happened. Some were ordered, some were trapped by timing, some remained because there were patients who could not be moved. In war, fate often disguises itself as logistics. The old belief was that evacuation meant safety. The reality was more complicated. Some who left were captured anyway. Some who stayed would survive. Some who escaped would spend years wondering about those who did not. There was no clean division between the fortunate and the doomed. By the first week of May, Corregidor was under terrible pressure. Japanese guns and aircraft had reduced much of the island's surface. The wounded were underground, and the nurses who remained with them were living inside the last hours of an American defense that had already become more symbolic than strategic. Outside, the island's guns were failing. Inside, the nurses still followed routine. That contrast is what makes the story so difficult to forget. A fortress can be in its final hours while a nurse still folds a dressing correctly. A campaign can be ending while someone checks a pulse. A surrender can be approaching while someone whispers to a patient to hold still because this will hurt. For the nurses left behind, capture was no longer a possibility at the edge of thought. It was coming down the tunnel toward them. When the fortress fell, when guns stop after days of bombardment, the silence does not feel peaceful. It feels wrong. On Corregidor, the silence came after too much noise. Shells, aircraft, concrete breaking, men shouting in tunnel corridors, stretchers scraping, radios coughing out orders and fragments. Then, gradually, the sound of organized defense weakened. One gun after another stopped answering. The island that had been called the Gibraltar of the East was being forced into surrender. Inside Malinta Tunnel, the nurses remained beside the wounded. They changed dressings, they checked fevers, they cleaned what could be cleaned. They tried to preserve modesty and dignity in a place where war had stripped both away from almost everyone. Men who had survived artillery now had to face something many found harder: helplessness. Surrender entered the hospital before the enemy did. It entered through faces, through the way officers moved, through the way rumors stopped sounding like rumors, through the absence of confidence in voices that once carried orders. The wounded understood before anyone officially told them. Men always know when the room changes. Japanese forces took control of the island. For the nurses, the category of their lives changed in an instant. They were no longer simply nurses in a besieged fortress. They were prisoners. The old belief collapsed completely. They had not been behind the war. They had not been outside the enemy's reach. Their status as medical personnel had not kept them separate from defeat. They were inside it, surrounded by it, named by it. And yet, for a time, the work continued. That is the part that matters. Captivity did not immediately erase responsibility. The wounded still needed care after the flag changed. A man's fever did not wait for political clarity. Infection did not pause because command had surrendered. Nurses who had worked under American authority now had to keep working under Japanese control, with less certainty, less protection, and no idea what rules would govern the next day. There was fear, of course. Fear of separation, fear of mistreatment, fear of what had happened to men on Bataan, fear of being moved, fear of not being moved, fear of losing identity piece by piece until nurse, officer, American, woman, all of it became secondary to prisoner. But discipline remained. Not loud discipline, not parade ground discipline, something smaller and harder. The habit of doing the next necessary thing. A dressing, a chart, a basin, a word to a frightened patient. The Japanese had captured the fortress. They had captured the wounded. They had captured the nurses. But they had not yet captured the routines that kept people human. That would become the next battle. Not Bataan, not Corregidor. The prison camp ward. The prison camp ward. Captivity changes time. Days become meals. Weeks become rumors. Months become bodies growing thinner in ways no mirror needs to explain. In Santo Tomas and Los Baños, the nurses entered a different kind of war, one without front lines, but with casualties all the same. The gates closed. The barbed wire remained. Food grew scarce. Disease moved through crowded spaces. The outside world became something heard through fragments. A rumor about the Pacific, a whisper about American ships, a distant hope that could not be trusted too much because hope, when it fails, takes strength with it. The nurses were prisoners. But they continued to nurse. That sentence is simple. Living it was not. Capt. Maude C. Davison became central to the survival of discipline among the army nurses. She was older than many of the women under her, and in captivity, age could become authority of a different kind. Not because it removed fear, but because it gave fear less room to govern the day. There were routines. Routines can sound small to people who have never been trapped. In a prison camp, they are not small. They are structure against dissolution. They tell the mind that mourning still exists, that work still matters, that identity has not been fully taken. A nurse who reports for duty inside a camp is doing more than treating a patient. She is refusing to let captivity define the entire meaning of her life. They cared for internees, civilians, the sick, the old, the starving, people whose bodies were beginning to consume themselves slowly because there was not enough food to sustain them. They watched swelling, weakness, infection, and despair. They knew what malnutrition did, not only to muscle, but to judgment, mood, patience, and hope. The old belief had been that once a front collapsed, organized resistance ended. The camp proved otherwise. Resistance did not always look like sabotage or escape. Sometimes it looked like keeping a patient clean when soap was scarce. It looked like dividing attention among people who all needed more than anyone could give. It looked like standing when the body wanted to sit. It looked like a woman who had lost weight herself, bending over someone weaker. The Japanese controlled the camp. They controlled movement, food, punishment, and access. But inside the ward, the nurses preserved a narrower territory. Not free, not safe, but meaningful. A place where skill still mattered, where a patient could still be addressed as a person, where the act of care made a thin barrier against the camp's slow attempt to reduce everyone to hunger. By 1945, their bodies were weakened. The war had moved across the Pacific, island by island, battle by battle, but inside the camp time had moved differently. It had moved through ration lines and sick lists. Then Manila began to shake again. This time, the guns were coming from the direction of liberation. But liberation would not arrive gently. Liberation through fire. Rescue, when it finally came, arrived through a burning city. By early 1945, American forces were returning to the Philippines. The promise made after the fall was no longer only a phrase. It was steel, engines, infantry, armor, and artillery moving toward Manila. But Manila was not an open door. It was a battlefield. For the prisoners inside Santo Tomas, the first signs were uncertain. More rumors, more tension among guards, more distant sound. The kind of sound that makes people afraid to hope, because hope can make waiting unbearable. Then the columns came. American armor and troops reached Santo Tomas in February 1945, breaking into the world the internees had inhabited for nearly 3 years. For the nurses, liberation did not look like a clean ending. It looked like confusion, noise, disbelief, and bodies too weak to respond the way the heart wanted to. Some smiled. Some cried. Some stared. Some may simply have kept working, because there were still patients. The photographs from liberation can mislead if viewed too quickly. A truck, a uniform, a rescued woman, a face turned toward the camera. The eye wants closure. It wants the story to be complete because the gate has opened. But a gate opening does not give back 3 years. It does not restore weight to the body overnight. It does not erase the memory of patients who died in camp wards. It does not remove the habit of saving food, listening for footsteps, or distrusting good news. It does not tell a nurse how to become herself again after surviving as a prisoner. The Navy nurses at Los Baños were liberated later in February. Their rescue was dramatic, swift, and dangerous, part of a broader race against time, as Japanese control broke apart and the final violence of occupation intensified. The old belief was that liberation ends suffering. The reality is that liberation ends captivity. Suffering often has to be carried out through the gate. Manila burned. Civilians died in terrible numbers. The city that had once represented the nurses' peaceful posting became a ruin around the moment of their rescue. The beginning and the end of their ordeal were tied to the same place, but the place itself had been transformed beyond recognition. They came home as survivors. But survival is not the same as being understood. And America, waiting on the other side of the ocean, would soon face a question it did not know how to answer. What kind of honor is owed to women who had fought without weapons after everyone else believed the battle was lost? The recognition that came too late. After liberation, there were medals. There were ceremonies, photographs, newspaper accounts, words like courage, devotion, sacrifice. The nurses of Bataan and Corregidor were honored, and they deserved every word of it. But public memory is selective. It knows how to remember certain kinds of war stories. It remembers the pilot in the cockpit, the Marine on the beach, the general at the map table, the ship under fire, the infantryman advancing through smoke. Those images fit the old shape of battle. They are easier to frame, easier to sell, easier to carve into legend. A nurse in a prison camp ward is harder for memory to hold. Not because her courage was smaller, because it was quieter. Her battlefield did not always produce explosions at the moment of decision. Her victories often remained invisible. A fever lowered, a wound kept clean, a man alive in the morning who might have died in the night. The camera rarely knows how to photograph prevention. It sees the rescued patient, but not the 100 small acts that kept him alive long enough to be rescued. The Army and Navy nurses received decorations, including Bronze Stars and unit recognition. Over the years, memorials and official acknowledgments would continue. Some names returned to public attention. Capt, Maude C. Davison, Laura Cobb, and Bernatitus, and others became part of the record for those willing to look. But for many viewers of history, they remained just beyond the frame. The old belief was that recognition follows sacrifice. The reality is less generous. Sometimes recognition arrives late. Sometimes it arrives formally but not culturally. Sometimes the military record preserves what popular memory forgets. Sometimes a person can be honored and still be unknown. That is why this story matters. Not to inflate them into myth. They were not invincible. They were tired, hungry, afraid, and human. Their importance lies exactly there. They did not survive because they were made of different material. They survived because discipline, training, and duty held when almost everything else had failed. And when they returned, they carried a kind of knowledge few people at home could fully receive. They knew what collapse smelled like. They knew what hunger did to a ward. They knew how a tunnel sounded under bombardment. They knew that courage was not always a charge forward. Sometimes it was coming back to the same cot again and again, after sleep had disappeared, after supplies had failed, after command had no more answers. Why do some forms of courage become legend while others become footnotes? The answer says as much about us as it does about war. What their survival changed. The story of the nurses in the Philippines is not only a story of endurance, it is also a reminder of what modern war forced medicine to become. World War II pushed nurses closer to combat than many earlier systems had imagined. Across theaters, nurses served in evacuation hospitals, field hospitals, hospital ships, trains, and aircraft. They treated blast wounds, burns, shock, infection, malaria, exhaustion, and the psychological damage that did not always have a name soldiers were willing to say aloud. They were part of the machinery of survival. Not decorative, not symbolic, necessary. The war changed many things about medical practice: speed of evacuation, use of blood and plasma, infection control, triage under pressure, surgical timing, and the coordination between frontline aid and rear hospitals. But none of those improvements mattered without people trained to perform care under stress. A system is only as strong as the hands that carry it. In the Philippines, those hands kept working after the system itself was broken. That is why the story has such force. In other theaters, Allied medicine often functioned with expanding resources and growing logistical strength. In Bataan and Corregidor, the nurses demonstrated something harsher: what care looks like when logistics collapse. The old belief separated combat from care. The battlefield reality did not. A bullet wound is combat entering the body. A field hospital is combat after impact. A fever ward in a prison camp is war continuing long after surrender. The nurses stood at that boundary, where strategy became flesh and policy became pain. Their legacy was not only in awards or memorials. It lived in the recognition that trained nurses were essential to military effectiveness. Armies do not only need men who can fight. They need systems that can return the wounded, preserve morale, and prevent injury from becoming death when death is not yet inevitable. Still, legacy can be uncomfortable. Because to honor them properly, we must admit how close they were to being forgotten. We must admit that the story of war has often been told through destruction more easily than through care. We must admit that survival itself can be a battlefield achievement. So, the story returns to where it began. To Malinta Tunnel. To the dim light. To dust falling from the ceiling. To a wounded man asking whether they were still holding. And to a nurse who did not answer with a speech. She answered by staying. They believed the front had collapsed. By the time Corregidor fell, the military meaning of the campaign was clear. The front had collapsed. The fortress surrendered. The enemy held the ground. The Philippines, for the moment, was lost. On a map, that is where the story might end. But war does not happen only on maps. It happens in bodies, in wounds, in fever, in hunger, in the hand that reaches for water and finds none, in the face of a man who knows he cannot walk. In the silence of a ward after the shelling stops and everyone understands what the silence means, the nurses of Bataan and Corregidor did not stop the fall of the Philippines. That is not the claim. They did something different, and perhaps harder to describe. They kept human beings alive inside defeat. They preserved fragments of order after order had failed. They carried medical discipline into places where medicine was not supposed to survive. Open-air hospitals under bombardment, tunnels under siege, prison camps under starvation. They believed nurses belonged behind the front. But what really happened was this. When the front collapsed, the wounded line did not end at the last trench, the last gun, or the last bunker. It ended at a hospital cot, where exhausted women kept fighting death with empty hands. The young soldier in Malinta Tunnel may never have known the full story of the woman bending over him. He may not have known her name. He may not have known how long she had been awake, how many patients she had already lost, or how little remained in the medical stores around her. He only knew that she was there. Sometimes, that is the difference between terror and surrender. A war can be lost on a map and still be resisted in a hospital ward. And in the middle of one of the darkest collapses of the Pacific War, the forgotten nurses of Bataan and Corregidor proved something no bombardment could erase. Survival, too, can be a form of resistance. If this story reached you, leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And if someone in your family served in the war as a soldier, sailor, nurse, medic, worker, or witness, share their story if you can. Many of the people who carried history did not ask to be remembered loudly, but they deserve not to disappear. For more forgotten stories from World War II, subscribe to Warfront Archive. What they believed. What really happened.